Chapter 11. The Long Reign. Jachaerys and Alysanne. Policy, Progeny, and Pain. On the 7th day of the 59th year after Aegon's conquest, a battered ship came limping up the Whispering Sound to the port of Aldtown. Her sails were patched and ragged and salt-stained, her paint faded and flaking, the banner streaming from her masts so sun-bleached as to be unrecognizable. Not until she was tied up at dock was she finally recognized in her sorry state. She was the Lady Meredith, last seen departing Aldtown almost 3 years earlier to cross the Sunset Sea. As her crew began to disembark, throngs of merchants, porters, whores, seamen, and thieves gaped in shock. 9 of every 10 men coming ashore were black or brown. Ripples of excitement ran up and down the docks. Had the Lady Meredith indeed crossed the Sunset Sea? Or the peoples of the fabled lands of the far west all dark-skinned as summer islanders? Only when Sir Eustace Hightower himself emerged did the whispers die. Lord Donal's grandson was gaunt and sunburned, with lines on his face that had not been there when he sailed. A handful of Aldtown men were with him, all that remained of his original crew. One of his grandsire's customs officers met him on the dock and a quick exchange ensued. The Lady Meredith's crew did not simply look like summer islanders, they were summer islanders, hired on in Sothorios, at ruinous wages. Sir Eustace complained, to replace the men he'd lost. He would require porters, the captain said. His holds were bulging with rich cargo. But not from lands beyond the Sunset Sea. That was a dream, he said. Soon enough Lord Donal's knights turned up, with orders to escort him to the Hightower. There, in his grandsire's high hall with a cup of wine in hand, Sir Eustace Hightower told his tale. Lord Donal's scribes scribbled as he spoke, and within days the story had spread all over Westeros, by messenger, bard, and raven. The voyage had begun as well as he could have hoped, Sir Eustace said. Once beyond the arbor, Lady Westhill had steered her sun chaser south by southwest, seeking warmer waters and fair winds, and the Lady Meredith and Autumn Moon had followed. The big Bravo Sea ship was very fast when the wind was in her sails, and the Hightowers had difficulties keeping pace. The 7 were smiling on us, at the start. We had the sun by day and the moon by night, and as sweet a wind as man or maid could hope for. We were not entirely alone. We glimpsed fisherfolk from time to time, and once a great dark ship that could only have been a whaler out of IB. And fish, so many fish, some dolphins swam beside us, as if they had never seen a ship before. We all thought that we were blessed. 12 days of smooth sailing out of Westeros, the Sun Chaser and her 2 companions were as far south as the Summer Islands, according to their best calculations, and farther west than any ship had sailed before, or any ship that had returned to tell of it, at least. Once Lady Meredith and Autumn Moon, casks of arbor gold were breached to toast the accomplishment. On Sun Chaser, the sailors drank a spiced honey wine from Lannisport. And if any man of them was disquieted that they had not seen a bird for the past 4 days, he held his tongue. The gods hate man's arrogance, the Septons teach us, and the 7-pointed star says that pride goes before a fall. It may well be that Alys Westhill and the Hightowers celebrated too loudly and too early, there in the ocean deeps, for soon after that the grand voyage began to go badly wrong. We lost the wind first, Sir Eustace told his grandfather's court. For almost a fortnight there was not so much as a breeze, and the ships moved only so far as we could tow them. It was discovered that a dozen casks of meat on Autumn Moon were crawling with maggots. A small enough thing by itself, but an ill omen. The wind finally returned one day near sunset, when the sky turned red as blood, but the look of it set men to muttering. I told them it boded well for us, but I lied. Before morning the stars were gone and the wind began to howl, and then the ocean rose. That was the first storm, Sir Eustace said. Another followed 2 days later, and then a third, each worse than the one before. The waves rose higher than our masts, and there was thunder all around, and lightning such as I had never seen before, great cracking bolts that burned the eyes. One struck the Autumn Moon and split her mast from the crow's nest down to the deck. In the midst of all that madness, one of my hands screamed that he had seen arms rising from the water, the last thing any captain needs to hear. We had lost all sight of Sun Chaser by then, all that remained was my lady and the moon. The sea was washing over our decks with every rise and fall, and men were being swept over the side, clinging uselessly to lines. One saw the Autumn Moon founder with my own eyes. One moment she was there, broken and burning, but there. Then a wave rose up and swallowed her and I blinked and she was gone, quick as that. That was all it was, a wave, a monster of a wave, but all my men were screaming, Kraken, Kraken. And not a word I said would ever disabuse them. I will never know how we survived that night, but we did. The next morning the sea was calm again, the sun was shining, and the water was so blue and innocent a man might never know that under it my brother floated, dead with all his men. Lady Meredith was in sad shape, sails torn, masts splintered, 9 men amongst the missing. We said prayers for the lost and set about making what repairs we could, and that afternoon, our crow's eye saw sails in the distance. It was Sun Chaser, come back to find us. Lady Westhill had done more than simply survive the storm. She had found land. The winds and raging seas that had separated her Sun Chaser from the Hightowers had driven her westward, and when the dawn broke, her man in the crow's nest had espied birds circling a hazy mountain peak on the horizon. Lady Alysanne made toward it and came upon 3 small islands. A mountain attended by 2 hills, as she put it. The Lady Meredith was in no fit shape to sail, but with the help of a tow from 3 boats off the Sun Chaser she was able to make the safety of the islands. The 2 battered ships sheltered off the islands for more than a fortnight, making repairs and replenishing their stores. Lady Alysanne was triumphant. Here was land farther to the west than any land had ever been known to be, islands that existed on no known chart. Since there were 3 of them, she named them Aegon, Rhaenys, and Visenya. The islands were uninhabited, but springs and streams were plentiful, so the voyagers were able to fill their casks with all the fresh water they required. There were wild pigs as well, and huge, sluggish gray lizards as big as deer, and trees heavy with nuts and fruit. After sampling some of those, Eustace Hightower declared that they had no need to go any farther. This is discovery enough, he said. We have spices here I have never tasted, and these pink fruits, we have our fortunes here, in our hands. Alice Westhill was incredulous. 3 small islands, even the largest of them a third the size of Dragonstone, that was nothing. The true wonders lay farther west. There might be another Essos just beyond the horizon. Or there might be another 1,000 leagues of empty ocean, Sir Eustace replied. And though Lady Alice cajoled and pleaded and wove webs of words in the air, she could not move him. Even had I wished to, my crew would not allow it, he told Lord Donnell in the Hightower. To a man, they were convinced they had seen a giant kraken pull autumn moon beneath the sea. Had I given the command to sail on, they would have fed me to the waves and found another captain. So the voyagers had parted ways as they left the islands. Lady Meredith turned back east for home, whilst Alice Westhill and her Sun Chaser pressed on westward, chasing the sun. Eustace Hightower's voyage home would prove to be nigh as perilous as his voyage out had been. There were more storms to be weathered, though none as terrible as the one that had claimed his brother's ship. The prevailing winds were against them, forcing them to tack and tack again. They had taken 3 of the great gray lizards on board, and one bit his steersman, whose leg turned green and had to be removed. A few days later, they encountered a pod of leviathans. One of them, a huge white bull larger than a ship, had slammed into Lady Meredith of a purpose, and cracked her hull. Afterward Sir Eustace had changed course, making for the Summer Islands, which he figured to be their nearest landfall. They were farther south than he had realized, however, and ended up missing the islands entirely and fetching up instead upon the coast of Sothorios. We were there for a full year, he told his grandsire, trying to make Lady Meredith seaworthy again, for the damage was greater than we'd thought. There were fortunes to be had there as well, though, and we were not blind to that. Emeralds, gold, spices, all that and more. Strange creatures, monkeys that walk like men, men that howl like monkeys, wyverns, basilisks, 100 different sorts of snakes. Deadly, all of them. Some of my men just vanished of a night. The ones who didn't began to die. One was bitten by a fly, a little prick upon his neck, nothing to fear. 3 days later his skin was sloughing off, and he was bleeding from his ears and cock and ass. Drinking salt water will make a man mad, every sailor knows that, but the fresh water is no safer in that place. There are worms in it, almost too small to see, if you swallowed them they laid their eggs inside you. And the fevers, hardly a day went by when half my men were fit to work. We all would have perished, I think, but some summer islanders passing by came on us. They know that hell better than they let on, I think. With their help, I was able to get Lady Meredith to Tall Trees Town, and from there to home. There ended his tale, and his great adventure. As for Lady Alice Westhill, born Alyssa of House Farman, where her adventure ended we cannot say. The sun chaser vanished into the west, still searching for the lands beyond the Sunset Sea, and was never seen again, except many years later, Corlys Velaryon, the boy born on Driftmark in 53 AC, would take his ship the Sea Snake on 9 great voyages, sailing farther than any man of Westeros had ever sailed before. On the first of those voyages, he sailed beyond the Jade Gates, to Yiti and the Isle of Leng, and returned with such a wealth of spice and silk and jade that House Velaryon became, for a time, the wealthiest house in all the 7 kingdoms. On his second voyage, Sir Corlys sailed even farther east, and became the first Westerosi ever to reach Asshai by the Shadow, the bleak black city of the Shadowbinders at the edge of the world. There he lost his love and half his crew, if the tales be true. And there as well, in Ashai's harbor, he glimpsed an old and much weathered ship that he would swear forevermore could only have been Sun Chaser. In 59 AC, however, Corlys Velaryon was a boy of 6, dreaming of the sea, so we must leave him and turn back once again to the end of autumn in that fateful year, when the skies darkened, the winds rose, and winter came again to Westeros. The winter of 59 to 60 AC was an exceptionally cruel one, all those who survived it agreed. The north was hit first and hardest, as crops died in the field, streams froze, and bitter winds came howling over the wall. Though Lord Alaric Stark had commanded that half of every harvest be preserved and put aside against the coming winter, not all his bannermen had obeyed. As their larders and granaries emptied, famine spread across the land, and old men bade farewell to their children and went out into the snow to die so their kin might live. Harvests failed in the Riverlands, the Westerlands, and the Vale as well, and even down into the Reach. Those who had food began to hoard, and all across the 7 kingdoms the price of bread began to rise. The price of meat rose even faster, and in the towns and cities, fruits and vegetables all but disappeared. And then the shivers came, and the stranger walked the land. The maesters knew the shivers. They had seen its like before, a century ago, and the course of the contagion was written in their books. It was believed to have come to Westeros from across the sea, from one of the free cities or lands more distant still. Port cities and harbor towns always felt the hand of the disease first and hardest. Many of the small folk believed that it was carried by rats, not the familiar gray rats of King's Landing and Aldtown, big and bold and vicious, but the smaller black rats that could be seen swarming from the holds of ships at dock and scurrying down the ropes that held them fast. Though the guilt of rats was never proved to the satisfaction of the Citadel, suddenly every house in the 7 kingdoms, from the grandest castle to the humblest hut, required a cat. Before the shivers ran its course that winter, kittens were selling for as much as destroyers. The marks of the disease were well known. It began simply enough, with a chill. Victims would complain of being cold, throw a fresh log on the fire, huddle under a blanket or a pile of furs. Some would call for hot soup, mulled wine, or, against all reason, beer. Neither blankets nor soups could stay the progress of the pestilence. Soon the shivering would begin, mild at first, a trembling, a shudder, but inexorably growing worse. Gooseprickles would march up and down the victims' limbs like conquering armies. By then the afflicted would be shivering so violently that their teeth would chatter, and their hands and feet would begin to convulse and twitch. When the victim's lips turned blue and he began to cough up blood, the end was nigh. Once the first chill was felt, the course of the shivers was swift. Death could come within a day, and no more than 1 victim in every 5 recovered. All this the maesters knew. What they did not know is where the shivers came from, how to stop it, or how to cure it. Poultices were tried, and potions. Hot mustards and dragon peppers were suggested, and wine spiced with snake venom that made the lips go numb. The afflicted were immersed in tubs of hot water, some heated almost to the point of boiling. Green vegetables were said to be a cure, then raw fish, then red meat, the bloodier the better. Certain healers dispensed with the meat, and advised their patients to drink blood. Various smokes and inhalations of burning leaves were tried. One lord commanded his men to build fires all around him, surrounding himself with walls of flame. In the winter of 59 AC, the shivers entered from the east, and moved across Blackwater Bay and up the Blackwater Rush. Even before King's Landing, the islands off the Crownlands felt the chill. Edwell Celtigar, Maegor's one-time hand and the much-despised master of coin, was the first lord to die. His son and heir followed him to grave 3 days later. Lord Staunton died at Rook's Rest, and then his wife. Their children, frightened, sealed themselves inside their bedchambers and barred the doors, but it did not save them. On Dragonstone, the queen's beloved Septa Edith perished. On Driftmark, Demon Valerion, Lord of the Tides, recovered after being at the point of death, but his second son and 3 of his daughters were borne away. Lord Bar Emin, Lord Rosby, Lady Jarell of Maidenpool. The bells tolled for them all, and many lesser men and women besides. All across the 7 kingdoms, the noble and humble alike were struck down. The old and the young were most at risk, but men and women in the prime of their lives were not spared. The roll of those taken included the greatest of lords, the noblest of ladies, the most valiant of knights. Lord Prentice Tully died shivering in Riverrun, followed a day later by his lady Lucinda. Lyman Lannister, the mighty lord of Castley Rock, was taken, together with sundry other lords of the Westerlands, Lord Marbrand of Ashemark, Lord Tarbeck of Tarbeck Hall, Lord Westerling of the Crag. At Highgarden, Lord Tyrell sickened but survived, only to perish, drunk, in a fall from his horse 4 days after his recovery. Rogar Baratheon was untouched by the shivers, and his son and daughter by Queen Alyssa were stricken but recovered, yet his brother Sir Ronald died, and the wives of both his brothers. The great port city of Aldtown was especially hard hit, losing a quarter of its population. Eustace Hightower, who had returned alive from Ali's Westhill's ill-fated voyage across the Sunset Sea, survived once again, but his wife and children were not as fortunate. Nor was his grandsire, Lord of the Hightower. Donald the Delayer could not delay death. He died shivering. So did the High Septon, 20 of the most devout, and fully a third of the archmaesters, maesters, acolytes, and novices at the Citadel. In all the realm, no place was as sorely afflicted as King's Landing was in 59 AC. Amongst the dead were 2 knights of the Kingsguard, old Sir Sam of Sour Hill and the good-hearted Sir Victor the Valiant, along with 3 lords of the council, Alban Massey, Carl Corbray, and Grand Maester Bennifer himself. Bennifer had served for 15 years through times both perilous and prosperous, coming to the Red Keep after Maegor the Cruel had decapitated his 3 immediate predecessors. An act of singular courage or singular stupidity, his sardonic successor would observe. I would not have lasted 3 days under Maegor. All the dead would be mourned and missed, but in the immediate aftermath of their passing, the loss of Carl Corbray was felt most grievously. With their commander dead and many of the city watch stricken and shivering, the streets and alleys of King's Landing fell prey to lawlessness and license. Shops were looted, women raped, men robbed and killed for no crime but walking down the wrong street at the wrong time. King Jachaerys sent forth his Kingsguard and his household knights to restore order, but they were too few, and he soon had no choice but to call them back. Amidst the chaos, his grace would lose another of his lords, not to the shivers but to ignorance and hate. Rego Draz had never taken up residence in the Red Keep, though there was ample room for him there, and the king had made the offer many times. The Pentoshi preferred his own manse on the Street of Silk, with the dragon pit looming above him atop the hill of Rhaenys. There he could entertain his concubines without suffering the disapproval of the court. After 10 years in service to the Iron Throne, Lord Rego had grown quite stout, and no longer chose to ride. Instead he moved from manse to castle and back again in an ornate gilded palanquin. Unwisely, his route took him through the reeking heart of Flea Bottom, the foulest and most lawless district of the city. On that dire day, a dozen of Flea Bottom's less savory denizens were chasing a piglet down an alley when they chanced to come upon Lord Rego moving through the streets. Some were drunk and all were hungry. The piglet had escaped them and the sight of the Pentoshi enraged them, for to a man they held the master of coin to blame for the high cost of bread. 1 wore a sword. 3 had knives. The rest snatched up stones and sticks and swarmed the palanquin, driving off Lord Rego's bearers and spilling his lordship onto the ground. Onlookers said he screamed for help in words none of them could understand. When his lordship raised his hands to ward off the blows raining down on him, golden gemstones glittered on every finger, and the attack grew more frenzied still. A woman shouted, "He's Pentoshi. Them's the bastards brung the shivers here." One of the men pried a stone up from the king's newly cobbled street and brought it down upon Lord Rego's head again and again, until only a red mash of blood and bone and brains remained. Thus died the Lord of Air, his skull crushed by one of the very cobblestones he had helped the king lay down. Even then, his assailants were not done with him. Before they ran, they ripped off his fine clothes and cut off all his fingers to lay claim to his rings. When word reached the Red Keep, Jachaerys Targaryen himself rode forth to claim the body, surrounded by his Kingsguard. So wroth was his grace at what he saw that Sir Joffrey Doggett would say afterward, when I looked upon his face, for a moment it was as if I were looking at his uncle. The street was full of the curious, come out to see their king or gaze upon the bloody corpse of the Pentoshi moneychanger. Jachaerys wheeled his horse about and shouted at them. I would have the name of the men who did this. Speak now, and you will be well rewarded. Hold your tongues, and you will lose them. Many of the watchers slunk away, but one barefoot girl came forward, squeaking out a name.